Howdy, I'm Kelley Unger, and welcome to the virtual San Juan County Fair Live. I am the co-superintendent of the baking booth with my sister, Chris.
I'm Kelley Unger.
Yes, as you see me, you might think you're seeing Chris Brown from Printonics, but I'm her twin sister, and I've lived here for 5 years. And it's one of my joys of the summer to help her with the baking booth. So before I get going into my demonstration, where I kind of talk about some tips and things like that, I want to make sure that you know where to go to enter in the fair. We're doing two methods. You can just do virtual, where you submit online a picture of your item, and we have some specific ways that you would submit those, and we'll just judge them based on what they look like, and it needs to have a recipe. And then the second way is to enter it virtually by bringing it in on August 7th to the fairgrounds. We will have a setup there. It'll be socially distanced, and it'll be staffed from 11 to 6, and then you'll bring in your submissions. We will help you submit them virtually, or if it gets too busy, we'll do all the paperwork that we would normally do and submit them virtually later. So I do want to encourage you to go to sjcfair.org and look at the baking booth link. Basically, I want you to know we have 10 different classes that you can submit in. The first one is cookies, and there's 3 different lots. If we have enough cookies, we will judge them by lots. There are drop cookies, brownies and bar cookies, rolled cookies, and refrigerator kind of cookies. There's class 2 is cupcakes, cakes, and torts. And then class 3 is decorated cakes, cupcakes, and cookies. Class 4 is yeast bread. Class 5 is quick breads. And class 6 is breakfast breads. And again, go to the website, see what those different classes are, because I know there's 3 bread classes, and they all have just little nuances about what is a proper entry for that class. Then we've got the favorite classic pies and tarts, class 7. Everybody lines up to be a judge there. This year, one thing that we're doing that's different is we will virtually accept cream custard or whipped pies, but we can't accept them in person because of the dairy that's in there. Class 7 is candy, so that's anything from fudge to divinity to peanut brittle. Healthful baked goods. That's a class that I wish we'd get more entries in, because you can take any recipe that you have and make it healthful by changing out the sugar, by changing out the fats, or by actually doing a gluten-free kind of recipe. And then the last class is 10, which is heritage recipes. And you can enter any class, candy, cupcakes, cakes, whatever, into this category, but it needs to have a story, a history. Like my grandmother made these for us when I was growing up, and you tell a story. So in heritage recipes, it's as much about the story as it is about the product. So those are all our categories. And what I'm going to do is as I go through this, I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips to encourage you to submit the best product you possibly can for the fair. One thing I need to remind everyone is, in order to get a blue ribbon in your category, you're judged against your product. But in order to get a blue ribbon, you've got to submit your recipe, and to get best of class, best of show, or one of the special awards, you need to have a recipe. So don't forget that, both in the virtual will not be judged for best of class or things like that, but we will still give them a blue ribbon if they have their recipe and they are presented well. If you're submitting virtually, be sure to look at the requirements for pictures, because we want to be able to see your whole product. We want to see the inside, see it cut up. If it's a group of cookies, we want to see, are they uniform? We want to see the back of them to make sure they're not burned, all kinds of things like that. So just read the rules. So today, as we're going to go into this, I am going to teach you how to make my special brownies. Anybody from a 4-year-old kid, I did it last summer and he won his class with the brownies, to adults can do this. You don't need a mixer, you don't need anything special except pans and basic implements. In fact, you can do a lot of it with a fork, but I'm going to do it with other implements today. So here's the brownie recipe. One tip, follow the recipe. You are free to experiment and make your gluten-free, make your sugar-free, whatever, but do not experiment with what you are going to submit for the day of the fair. Try it out multiple times to make sure it really tastes good before you submit it. And then also, once you've got it down, stick to it. So follow it exactly. The others is look at things like preparation. If it asks you to grease and flour a pan, there's a reason why you do that. If it asks you to put down some parchment paper in the pan, that's so it won't stick. So be sure to follow the preparation instructions. And my preparation says to rub the pan with butter or some other kind of grease. And why this is important, especially with bar cookies and brownies, is because it helps to keep it from sticking, but it also helps to flavor the edges, to crisp the edges, to help them pull away from the pan so they'll be the most beautiful presentation you could possibly have. And it's just a good thing to do. Some people ask, well, I've got these nonstick pans. Does that mean I don't have to grease my pan? And unless you have health reasons why you're not greasing the pan, I would suggest that you grease the pan because it really does improve the flavor. And I'm greasing with real butter. Another tip, if it asks for real butter or salted butter versus unsalted, follow the directions. So let me clean off my hands a little bit so I can do the rest of it. So I got it all buttered, maybe more than I need to, but I know how much the butter really helps on this recipe. The next thing you want to do is it asks for more butter, and I have my melted butter here. It's a half a cube or a cube, which is a half a cup. So where did my spatula go? There it is. So I have that melted, and when you're doing a recipe, follow the order. If it says in this recipe, it says combine the sugar and the butter. And you might see, well, but that's so much work to just do it step by step. But there's a reason why it wants you to do it in that order. And we're going to follow the order and do it as they ask. I'm using a cup of sugar. I'm using granulated sugar here. I've had a lot of questions in the past about when it says different kinds of sugar, what kind of sugar should you use? Again, follow the recipe. There are some recipes that call for something called baker's sugar, and you'll see it in this. And the reason they call for it is because it's an extra fine sugar, and it melds quicker with the butter. And I'll tell you a story. Once I was making my brother-in-law's favorite silk chocolate pie, and I used regular sugar instead of baker's sugar, because I didn't have the baker's sugar. And we all have this happen. And he said, this is really, really, really good, except that it's kind of got a grain to it. And yeah, that's why, is because I did not use the baker's sugar. Okay, the next thing that this recipe asks for is eggs. And it asks in the recipe to combine them one at a time and mix them until they're combined. Again, there's a reason. It wants to really incorporate that egg into the butter and sugar and do it individually so you don't get too much at one time. And you want to make sure that you don't see any white, you don't see any yolk in there, and that it's smooth and all the same color. You mix in the second one. And again, in that French silk pie recipe that I made, it asks you to add 1 egg at a time and beat it in a mixer at high speed for 5 minutes. And you go, oh, that's 20 minutes of eggs, just adding the eggs. If you add them all at one time, it doesn't work. It's trying to incorporate air into the recipe and get it creamy. And so you, again, just follow the directions. The next thing this asks for is vanilla, and it's a teaspoon of vanilla. And I use real vanilla extract, not imitation, because again, it's the best. Butter, you can always tell in a recipe when somebody's used margarine or imitation vanilla instead of real vanilla. So I know it's expensive, but if you want the best product for the fair, use the real stuff. And you mix that, and again, incorporate it until it's all incorporated. And the next thing is some, let's see, cocoa powder. Oh, so you can use, I put this here, cacao is the same thing as cocoa powder. It's just that it's not processed. And so it has a slightly different flavor, but it's something you can substitute 1 for 1. So I use cacao, and it's 1/3 cup of cacao. And again, you incorporate it, but I also put in a little touch of cinnamon, kind of makes it like a little Mexican-y. I just put 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon in. And you don't have to pack it in. You just lightly bring it into your spoon and make sure it's leveled. Some of your teaspoons come with a little leveler right here. I don't know if you can see this, but you can actually use it to level it off and make it perfect when you do it. We're gonna incorporate that all in. This gets a little messy. You have to do it a little bit slower. If you do it too fast, you end up with chocolate powder all over your face, which I've done before. And when I have kids do it, they love to just spin it really fast. And yeah, it doesn't work that way. In fact, last summer, I videotaped myself teaching a little 4-year-old how to do this. And the first thing he did was do that really fast. And it just blew up everywhere and got on my camera. Okay, the next thing, you'll often in recipes, it'll say in a separate bowl. And what's the mantra? If it says in a separate bowl, do it in a separate bowl. A lot of people just want to dump the flour and the salt and the baking powder right into here and stir it, because this is an extra thing to clean. It's an extra thing to do. But mixing it together, cinnamon. Sorry, we'll have to sweep that up later. Elbow. You do make messes in the kitchen. It's natural. Okay, so this asks for 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour. Again, you can substitute gluten-free. Try it in advance. The best one that I've used for gluten-free is actually I think it's called Namaste 1 for 1, and you can get it at Costco. It's in a blue bag. It's the best because they've already kind of taken the guesswork out of, will this flour rise? Will this combination? You can do other things like cassava flour, all different kinds of flours that are gluten-free. Again, try it out a couple of times, make sure that it's consistent flavor. And then it wants 1/4 teaspoon of salt and 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. So I've got my baking powder here. Can just use the can and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. You shouldn't technically measure over the bowl like I did earlier with the vanilla, because you sometimes make a mistake and pour a lot more in. And again, you want to make sure that you're following the recipe and getting in what it asks for. There's a thing called colloidal chemistry, and it's the science of cooking. And it tells you just how much of a certain thing, baking powder, baking soda, You can also, there are things you can substitute if you really do run into the fact that you don't have what you were looking for. But, and come to the fair, because we have all these charts of what can I substitute for this, if I need gluten-free, if I'm eggs, there are things you can substitute for eggs if you're not an egg eater or allergic to them. So now this is an important step in most, especially brownies, muffins, is how do you blend your flour? If it asks you to fold it in, this is called folding, where you're not stirring really briskly. Gluten binds and makes things chewy and tough if you over stir it or over blend it. So especially when you're making muffins, don't worry if you see a tiny bit of unincorporated flour or dry products, because the truth is, if you get it if you stir it too vigorously, you take away it'll just be tough. The air in it gets beaten down and it'll be too tough. And that's not a good flavor. And you can tell if somebody's overbeat something because it will be tough and you get this cauliflower look to the top of a really good muffin, and that's because you haven't over stirred it. So here's where if you have a 4-year-old around, they love, or even adults who like this is the best part. Always make sure that your hands are clean when you're cooking. I did sanitize my hands before I came in. Okay, so we've got our batter. Okay, it's not all going to be perfect. Martha Stewart, how does she do it? The one last thing that I'm going to do is to add chocolate chips, because that really makes it best. Get this out of the way. And then here is where I'm not going to stir it much more. I'm just going to lightly incorporate the chocolate chips. And at this point, if you had something like dried cherries that you wanted to add, or nuts, you can do all kinds of things that make a simple brownie mix your own. But remember that it has to be from scratch. It can't be a brownie mix from the store. Everything has to come from scratch. Okay, so last thing is you want to put it in your pan. Sometimes I double this recipe and bake one that I can then freeze in the same size, or other times when I double it, I put it in a big pan. And just remember that if you put it in a bigger pan, it may take a different time to cook, and it might be a little bit less done in the middle, because all of these recipes, the timing and the pan size, they're all important, and you just need to know how to adjust your recipe or your baking time or your oven time in order to make the best product. And so if I'm going to split them into two, like this in this size pan, what I will do is I will actually get out a scale, and I will make sure that I weigh, and this scale works. You can just put on the scale and weigh them and make sure that they both weigh within not an ounce, I would say within a half ounce of each other or so that they're exactly the same quantity and they'll bake at the same temperatures. So as I get this all spread out, the other is to make sure that when you're spreading it out, that it goes to the edge of the pan, and you can see that I'm getting it to the edge of the pan, and you want it to be fairly even throughout the pan. You don't want to have like the corners really low and the center really high, because again, it won't bake correctly. It'll get too done on the edges where there's not as much, and it will not be done in the middle. Now, one thing I didn't talk about earlier, I should have set my oven up and made sure that it's preheated beforehand. And so I'm going to throw this in my invisible oven over here. But one of the things you need to make sure is that your oven actually cooks to the temperature that you think it's cooking to. Again, the recipe tells you what temperature. So what I have at home, because I know my oven doesn't heat properly, is I have this, I hang it in my oven, and I put it in there about after it's come to full heat. I put it in there and I leave it in there for 5 to 10 minutes. And if this doesn't register the temperature that I think it should, then I turn up the temperature. At the low temperatures, my oven runs 10 degrees cool. So I need, if it's 350, I need to put it at 360. And at the high temperatures, it actually runs 25 degrees cool. So if I want it at 425 to 500, I have to go 25 degrees above that. And so it's a good thing to have one of these around if you're a serious baker and want to make sure that you're baking it correctly. So that will go in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes, depending on how big a pan you're doing. I also wanted to talk about other things you need around the house. If you're making drop cookies, you know, a lot of people use 2 spoons to drop their cookies. But if you want a really, really even size, it's really good to have a scoop like these. They're called cookie scoops. And that way, when you do a cookie, you can take the batter and you can drag it against the side and they all come out absolutely even. And then you cook it and it drops it on your cookie sheet. So having some scoops that make it really even, again, the more even the cookies are going on your pan, the more evenly they will all cook. The other is having the scale is helpful, especially if you don't trust that your measuring cups, like if you've had trouble with things being dry or too runny, sometimes they'll have grams on there and weighing it tells you that your measuring cups aren't measuring right. The other thing is when you're doing flour, some people, you know, do the scoop method of flour. They take their scoop in and they pull it through the flour and they're actually packing it in there too tight and it weighs too much. So what you can do is use another measuring spoon to take the flour and put it in, and then you use a knife or my handy dandy to even it off. But don't do things like, you know, unless it tells you to pack something, don't pack it. Same with, you know, brown sugar and sugars. There's a lot of different kinds of sugars you can use. This is called turbinado sugar. It has molasses in it. It's a different flavor, so don't substitute it if you don't want a molasses flavor. This is a raw sugar. It can be pretty much, if it's the right grain size, it can be substituted for white sugar. It's not as highly processed. But light and dark sugar, brown sugars, one has a lot more molasses in it. So if it's asking for a certain kind of sugar, use that sugar or test and make sure that it produces the flavor that you wanted it to produce. Now, and that's another thing you'll understand about judges. Judges have, you know, they can try and be as biased as possible, but some of them just don't like certain flavors. And so they have to really put aside what they like and dislike when they're testing things. But at the same time, if a judge loves butter and you don't taste it in your recipe, they might judge you down if your recipe calls for butter and they don't taste it. The other thing about when you're getting ready to bring your stuff to the fair, make sure that you don't package it too soon. So like I make granola, and if you put it into the can when it's warm, a jar or a plastic bag or anything, if it's warm, it will be soggy. So make sure it cools to room temperature before you package it. Same thing with pies. If you go put a piece of foil over a pie and it's still too warm, it will ruin your crust. Okay, so by the magic of already having one baked, we have a pan of brownies. So this is what it should look like when it comes out. You want to make sure you have some toothpicks to test your brownies or any kind of cakes that you do. And make sure that when you put the toothpick in, it comes out clean. You may not be able to see that, but I can tell you it came out clean. If you've got chocolate chips or something in there, make sure that what you're pulling out is the chocolate chip and not the cake. You can tell the difference because there's a creamy feel about chocolate chips, whereas you might have hit a chocolate chips and bring out that on your toothpick. But do make sure that your toothpick comes out clean. That tells you it's done. And the last step is, how am I going to present this? So for the fair, if I were going to submit these for the fair, I would want to submit them in a way that shows that they're not burned. These happen to get a little tiny bit brown, so I'll be honest with you on that. You also want to submit what they tell you. So if they want 4 brownies or 6 cookies or whatever, look at what they want. But you want to submit something that gives a representation of the whole piece. If you're not bringing in the whole pan, which you're not. And so what I would do with this pan is I would submit a corner cookie. Now, if I really had burned and made these really bad, maybe I wouldn't, and they would probably know that my corners had gotten burned. But look how easy those come out. I want you to see that there is absolutely nothing stuck to the bottom of that pan. So I would put out this is an edge piece, this is a corner piece, and I would do a couple middles. So give them some representative pieces. And also, if you're doing cookies, when you do it virtually.
Someone just mentioned that you're supposed to take a picture of it before you cut it.
Oh, yes, this is true. Thank you. That's probably my sister watching. Yes, you're supposed to take a picture before you cut it. Thank you, Sister Chris. And I would make sure that you also turn it over. It's, of course, on brownies, it's hard to tell if they're burned because unless they're really, really burned. But with white cookies, you know, we want to see the top and the bottom. With a cake or a pie, we want to see a cross section of the pie. You're not going to turn a pie upside down and show us the bottom, although you could, and that would give us the confidence on your virtual that you actually had not burned your pie crust. And there's a thing with pies, you know, just make sure that if you're cooking a pie, that you allow it to cool to a point that it is not really hot when you bring it in, because it could ruin the crust if it's too hot. I'm trying to think if there's any other things I missed, but we're going back to the beginning of submitting your virtual. Make sure that you follow the directions. If you're doing a heritage, make sure you tell us a story. If you want to get a blue ribbon or a best of show or anything like that, make sure you submit your recipe. And just have fun, experiment, but experiment before you submit your stuff. Don't experiment that day. The other is don't think that if you have something to submit at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that you're going to have it ready in 1 hour and it'll be ready for us to taste. Give yourself time to bring this product to room temperature. Give yourself time to bake it. When you sign up this year, you'll have to be signing up for a spot to bring it in. And you need to be respectful of that time because we want to keep social distancing. And we only have so many people there to receive. So make sure that you plan ahead, get your product done. We know that emergencies happen, but I would encourage you to just think about this the day before or the week before, and not necessarily that morning. What am I going to do?
Do we know dates yet?
The dates, so number one, your online submissions, your virtual submissions are July 1st to July 31st. The day that we're going to actually be at the fairgrounds receiving your items is August 7th from 11 in the morning to 6 at night, and then we will judge those items and post them, get them all submitted so that the week of the fair, all the pictures will be up and all the awards will be given and things like that. And the fair is the 18th through the 21st. So yeah, July 1st to 31st virtual, August 7th in person. We still need judges. We still need people to sign up. So if you go to the baking department page, it'll have a link to the Sign Up Genius for both volunteers and submissions, and sign up. If you have 5 or 6 submissions, be sure to indicate that so that we know how to plan for you coming and we have enough people to receive it. If you're a family, sign up for multiple slots. I think we have 5 or 6 slots, each 15 minutes. But don't sign up for one slot as a family. Sign up for each person so that we'll know there's 6 people coming to submit all their stuff. And just again, follow the rules, follow the recipe, and have fun. Bye.